A conservationist spotted a lion cub lying next to its mother, but something was strange when he decided to go closer to check it out, and then the last rays of sunlight stretched across the vast plains of Botswana, painting the wilderness in shades of gold and amber. A gentle breeze swept through the dry grass, carrying with it the scent of earth, vegetation, and something else. The unmistakable tang of blood. Ethan, a seasoned wildlife conservationist, gripped the wheel of his old pickup truck as he navigated the rugged dirt paths of the reserve. It was supposed to be just another routine patrol, but then from the corner of his eye he spotted something small, curled up in the tall grass. His chest tightened. A lion cub, frail and trembling, nestled against the motionless body of a fully grown lioness. Its mother. Ethan brought the truck to a stop, stepping out cautiously. The air was thick with the stench of death. The lioness lay still, her golden coat marred by dust and blood. As he knelt beside her, his trained eyes quickly caught the cause. A bullet wound, deep and fatal. Poachers. They had taken her life, most likely for her skin or bones, but had left the cub behind. Perhaps they hadn't noticed it, or perhaps they simply didn't care. Ethan turned his gaze to the tiny cub. It wasn't moving. Its eyes, clouded with exhaustion and dehydration, barely flickered in response to his presence. The fragile ribs beneath its thin fur rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths. It was on the verge of death. He reached out and gently touched its back. No reaction. A war raged inside him. If he left it here, nature would take its course. The laws of the wild were unforgiving. Lions were not meant to be raised by humans, but if he walked away, the cub wouldn't make it through the night. His fists clenched. Could he really abandon it? Ethan bent down and slid his hands beneath its frail body. It was disturbingly light. Something that should have been full of life and strength had been reduced to nothing more than a whisper of existence. Lifting it carefully, he cradled it against his chest. "You're not dying tonight, little one." For the first time in his career, Ethan broke protocol. He intervened. As he gazed down at the helpless creature in his arms, a name formed in his mind, one that carried the promise of a second chance. "I'm calling you Nya." It means hope. And beneath the vast African sky, a man and a lion cub unknowingly embarked on a journey that would change both of their lives forever. The ride back to the wildlife reserve felt like an eternity. Ethan kept one hand on the wheel, the other carefully cradling the fragile lion cub beside him. Nya barely moved. Her breathing was so shallow he found himself glancing at her every few seconds, terrified that, at any moment, she might stop altogether. The thought gnawed at him. Had he been too late? He pressed harder on the gas pedal. When he finally arrived, the reserve was quiet. Most of the rangers had already turned in for the night, leaving only the distant calls of hyenas and the rhythmic chirping of crickets to break the silence. Ethan hurried inside his modest cabin, placing Nya on a blanket near the fireplace. She remained completely still. Her body was cold. A sharp pang of panic hit him. He grabbed a thick towel and wrapped her tiny frame, rubbing her sides gently to create warmth. Moving quickly, he prepared a bottle of milk, though he knew it wasn't a perfect substitute. Lion cubs needed their mother's milk, rich with essential nutrients and antibodies, but he had to work with what he had. He knelt beside her, bringing the bottle to her lips. "Come on, girl, just a little," he murmured. No response. His heart pounded. If she didn't drink, she wouldn't make it through the night. Desperate, he tried using a small syringe, letting a few drops of milk drip onto her tongue. At first, the liquid merely rolled off. Then, she swallowed. Ethan exhaled sharply. It wasn't much, but it was something. For the next 2 hours, he fed her tiny sips of milk, massaged her paws to encourage circulation, and kept her close to the warmth of his own body. Exhaustion clawed at him, but he refused to leave her side. Sometime before dawn, a faint noise broke the silence. Nya let out a weak whimper. Ethan's tired eyes widened. Slowly, she lifted her tiny paw, stretching her fragile limbs for the first time. Then, as if drawing upon the last remnants of her strength, she released another soft, raspy sound. Something between a purr and a meow. A weak one, but unmistakably a sign of life. "That's my girl," Ethan whispered, a tired but relieved smile tugging at the corner of his lips. The days that followed were a blur of constant care. Every 2 hours he fed her, ensuring she got the nutrients she needed. She remained frail, but little by little she grew stronger. By the end of the first week she could lift her head. By the second, she wobbled on unsteady legs, and by the third she began following him around the cabin, her steps clumsy but determined. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was fighting. But just when Ethan started to believe she was out of danger, disaster struck. One evening he noticed something was off. Nya, who had been eating well for days, suddenly refused her milk. She lay curled in the corner of the room, breathing heavily. A cold dread settled in his stomach as he knelt beside her, pressing his fingers gently against her forehead. She was burning up. Fever. Lion cubs were incredibly fragile, and no matter how well he had cared for her, her body was still weak. If an infection had set in, she might not survive it. He needed medicine. The reserve's small supply of veterinary drugs didn't have what she required. The nearest town with a proper clinic was nearly 200 kilometers away. Waiting until morning wasn't an option. Ethan grabbed his keys. Carefully wrapping Nya in a thick blanket, he carried her out to the truck. She let out a weak whimper, her body limp against his chest. "Hold on, girl, I need you to fight," he whispered, his voice thick with worry. The dirt roads were treacherous at night, uneven terrain making the truck lurch and shake. Ethan's hands were tight on the wheel, his knuckles white. He was pushing the truck to its limits when suddenly, a flash of movement. Out of nowhere, a massive shape loomed into view. Ethan slammed on the brakes. A towering elephant stood in the middle of the road, its dark silhouette blocking the path. The animal's ears flared slightly, its trunk swaying as if considering whether the approaching vehicle was a threat. Ethan held his breath. If the elephant charged, it could flip his truck in an instant. But he didn't have time to wait. Honking wouldn't help. It might only startle the creature. Instead, Ethan reached for his flashlight, aiming the beam downward at the ground, careful not to shine it directly into the elephant's eyes. The enormous animal hesitated, then slowly turned and disappeared into the darkness. Ethan didn't waste a second. He floored the gas. By the time he reached the town, Nya was barely breathing. The veterinary clinic was already open when he arrived, and he burst through the doors, carrying her in his arms. The vet, a middle-aged woman named Dr. Kendra, quickly took the cub from him, her face set in grim concentration. "She's severely dehydrated," Dr. Kendra murmured as she examined Nya. "We need to get fluids in her, now." Ethan could do nothing but watch as they worked. A small IV was inserted into Nya's tiny leg, delivering much-needed hydration. He had fought for her survival for weeks, but now her fate was out of his hands. Hours passed. Ethan paced the waiting area, exhaustion threatening to pull him under, but he refused to close his eyes. Had he waited too long? Had he failed her? The sun was just beginning to rise when Dr. Kendra finally emerged from the treatment room. She smiled. "She's going to be okay." Ethan's legs nearly gave out from sheer relief. He rushed to Nya's side. She was still weak, her small body wrapped in a soft towel, but when she saw him, she let out the tiniest, most exhausted purr. She knew him. She still recognized him. For the first time in days, Ethan smiled. "You're a fighter, aren't you, Nya?" he murmured, stroking her fur. And at that moment he knew she wasn't just another rescue case. She was family. The journey back from the veterinary clinic was different this time. Nya was no longer a lifeless bundle in his arms. She was weak, but awake. Every few minutes she would let out a small sound, a faint purr or a tired whimper, as if reminding him she was still there, still fighting. Ethan glanced at her curled-up form in the passenger seat. "You scared the hell out of me, kid," he muttered, shaking his head. Nya didn't respond, of course, but for the first time since he'd found her, she seemed aware of her surroundings. Her small golden eyes flickered open now and then, watching him, her little body rising and falling with deep, slow breaths. For the first time, Ethan let himself believe she was going to make it. Back at the reserve, Nya slowly regained her strength. Days turned into weeks, and her tiny, frail body started filling out with muscle. Her legs grew stronger, her steps more confident. She still slept curled beside Ethan's bed, still followed him like a shadow wherever he went. By the end of the 3rd month, she had transformed. no longer the helpless, shivering cub he had found, but a growing predator. Her paws larger, her reflexes sharper, she had the makings of a lioness. But there was one problem. She didn't know how to be one. Nya had no pride to teach her the ways of the wild, no mother to show her how to hunt. She relied on Ethan for everything, and that terrified him. One evening, Ethan sat on the porch of his cabin, watching Nya play in the fading sunlight. She chased bugs, pounced on the tall grass, her movements still a little clumsy but unmistakably feline. She wasn't just a pet, she was a lion. And that meant one thing: she couldn't stay with him forever. If he truly loved her, he had to teach her to survive on her own. The next morning he took her to the reserve's training enclosure, a massive, fenced-off section of land designed to prepare rehabilitated animals for the wild. It was filled with trees, tall grass and, most importantly, small game. Ethan released a young gazelle into the field. It bolted the moment its hooves hit the dirt, disappearing into the brush. Nya didn't chase it. Instead, she looked up at Ethan, tilting her head expectantly. Ethan felt something inside him twist. "You're supposed to be hunting, kid," he said softly. Nya let out a small sound and trotted toward him instead, rubbing against his leg like a house cat. Ethan exhaled. This was going to be harder than he thought. Over the next few weeks he kept his distance. He stopped feeding her directly, forcing her to rely on her instincts. He introduced her to live prey, watched as she hesitated, uncertain of what to do. At night, she would sit outside his cabin, staring at the door, waiting for him to let her in. He didn't. It killed him. But one day, something changed. Ethan was out in the enclosure, observing from a distance, when he heard the sound of rustling grass. He turned just in time to see Nya stalking a small warthog, her body low to the ground, her muscles coiled. For a moment she hesitated, then she pounced. It wasn't perfect. She missed her mark and the warthog squealed, bolting into the distance. But she had tried, and Ethan had never been prouder. Over time she improved. She learned to track, to stalk, to hunt. She grew stronger, faster, more independent. But there was one thing she never outgrew: her bond with Ethan. Even after she became a skilled hunter, she would still greet him every morning, pressing her massive head into his chest. She would still run to him when he called, still seek his presence when the night grew cold. And that was the problem. She wasn't afraid of humans, and that could get her killed. Ethan knew that if she were ever released into the wild, she might approach poachers, thinking they were like him. She might wander into villages, unafraid of people, and that could mean disaster. One evening, as they sat together under the endless Botswana sky, Ethan absently ran his fingers through her thick golden fur. "You don't belong here," he murmured. "But you don't belong out there either. Not yet." She responded with a deep, contented rumble, pressing closer against him. Ethan swallowed past the lump in his throat. He was going to have to make a choice, and he wasn't sure he could. The morning was colder than usual. A crisp wind swept through the tall grass, rustling the dry leaves as the sun struggled to break through the low-lying mist. Ethan stood outside the reserve's enclosure, hands shoved deep into his pockets, watching Nya from a distance. She moved through the grass with silent precision, her body sleek and powerful. In the months since she had learned to hunt, she had transformed, no longer the fragile cub he had once held in his arms, but a full-grown lioness, radiating strength. And yet, she was still his Nya. She still ran to him at sunrise, still greeted him with playful nudges, still sought his company when the world grew quiet. She trusted him completely, and that was why she could never be truly wild. Ethan exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. He had spent weeks agonizing over this moment, weighing every option. He had called other conservationists, sought advice from experts, but deep down, he had always known the answer. If Nya stayed here, she would never be free, and if she left, she might not survive. But keeping her wasn't an act of love. It was selfishness. His grip tightened around the metal fence as he watched her chase after a bird, leaping effortlessly before landing in the grass with a frustrated huff. She was still so much like the cub he had saved, but she wasn't one anymore. It was time. That afternoon, Ethan led her toward the far end of the reserve, where the fence met the open plains. She followed him without hesitation. When they reached the gate, he stopped, pressing his hand against the warm metal. Naya came up beside him, looking up expectantly. She had no idea what was happening. Ethan took a slow breath and unlatched the gate. The heavy iron groaned as it swung open, revealing the endless wilderness beyond. Naya stared at it. Then she turned to him. Ethan forced a smile. "Go on, girl, it's time." She didn't move. Instead, she stepped closer, pressing her massive head into his chest, just like she had always done. Ethan clenched his jaw, his hands tightening in her thick fur. He had prepared for this. But nothing, not all the logic, not all the reasoning, could prepare him for the reality of letting her go. "Go. Naya," he whispered, "be what you were meant to be." She hesitated for one more moment. Then, finally, she turned. Ethan watched as she took her first steps into the wild, and even when she disappeared into the golden horizon, he stood there, his heart breaking, his soul aching, knowing he had done the only thing he could. He had set her free. Days passed, then weeks. Ethan tried to settle back into his routine at the reserve, but everything felt different without Nya. The mornings felt quieter, the sunrises lonelier. He still woke up expecting to hear her soft huffs outside his cabin, still caught himself glancing over his shoulder, half expecting to see her golden form trailing behind him. But she was gone. And that was how it was supposed to be. The rangers had spotted her a few times near the far edges of the reserve. She was hunting successfully, strong, capable, surviving. She had even been seen interacting with a distant pride, though it was unclear if they had accepted her. That gave Ethan some comfort. At least she wasn't alone. But the worry never truly left him. One evening, as he sat outside his cabin watching the sunset, a storm began to roll in from the east. The sky darkened, clouds thick and heavy with rain. Lightning cracked in the distance, illuminating the vast plains for only a second. Then, through the howling wind, he heard it. A roar. It was distant, but unmistakable. Ethan shot up, his heart pounding. He knew that roar. Nya. Without thinking, he grabbed his jacket and a flashlight, running toward the open plains. His boots sank into the damp earth as the first drops of rain began to fall. But he didn't stop. Another roar rang out, louder this time, filled with something raw, something wrong. Fear jolted through him. Something was happening. When he finally reached the far end of the reserve, the sight before him made his breath catch. A group of hyenas, 6, maybe 7, circled a lone lioness. "Na!" She stood tall, her body tense, her golden coat bristling in the dim light. But she was outnumbered. One hyena lunged, snapping at her leg. She swiped at it, a deep snarl rumbling from her throat, but another one darted behind her, biting at her flank. Ethan's blood ran cold. She was fighting, but she wouldn't last much longer. Without thinking, he did the only thing he could. He yelled! The sound was sharp, unnatural, cutting through the storm. He waved his flashlight wildly, the bright beam flashing across the hyenas. For a moment they hesitated. Then, with one last eerie cackle, they scattered into the darkness. Ethan ran to Nya. She was panting, her sides heaving. A few shallow wounds marked her legs, but she was standing, still strong. She lifted her head, her golden eyes locking onto his, and then, to his shock, she stepped forward and pressed her head into his chest, just like she always had. Ethan swallowed hard, his arms tightening around her massive frame. "You found your way back," he whispered. Maybe she had never truly left.